Okay. Hello, this is Eric Topol, and this is a rare privilege for me to interview my favorite epidemiologist, Dr. Michael Osterholm. He is the Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota. He's director of CIDRAP, which is certainly one of the leading entities around the world, public health. And we've been friends for the last few years, which we'll talk about. So, welcome, Michael. Such a great privilege to have you today.
Well, thank you. The honor really is mine, as I have shared with you and others know very well. You have been a real mentor to me and many others during this pandemic, and I could never repay you adequately for all that you've helped teach me throughout these last 3 years.
Well,
It's been immeasurable.
no, you're too kind. I think it's much different, the opposite way. I've learned so much from you because this isn't my area, as you well know, of COVID and related matters. I thought we'd start with, of course, right now things are relatively good for the pandemic in the United States and mostly around the world, with relatively less cases, less hospitalizations and deaths. Um, but interestingly, obviously, still people are getting infected, and maybe you can tell us uh, the recent case that you went through. That would be enlightening.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all trying to understand when the pandemic ends. And as we've discussed many times before, we'll probably know that about a year after it ends. Then we'll say, yep, that was the end of it. Uh, don't for a moment think that at the end means that there won't be cases. For every infectious agent that we think of in causing a pandemic, they still come back, whether it be influenza or potentially coronaviruses. They will continue to circulate. It's a matter of how many cases occur, how many people die, and I think that's an important point. There isn't really a definition for when a pandemic ends. I guess it's just when you feel like it's over. And clearly, the world has come to that conclusion already. You don't need an epidemiologist or a politician to tell them that the pandemic's over. They feel that. We're still seeing about 165 deaths a day in this country from COVID, so it's hardly gone away completely. But we do have to acknowledge that most of those deaths are in older individuals, people who have not been vaccinated recently with bivalent boosters. And in that regard, we could surely even reduce the illnesses further. I don't have any faith right now in the surveillance systems that have been set up to look at cases around the world. We've pretty much dismantled that, and we are not testing people. It results in reports being made to public health agencies, whether in this country or anywhere else in the world. So I really look at two other things. One is deaths, and even they're realizing that still is a challenge in terms of how complete death reporting is due to COVID. But then the other thing we're looking at, which has been really one of the, you might say, public health revolution during the pandemic. And I say revolution because it's really changed things. And that is the issue of wastewater surveillance. And we've been able to ascertain in many areas of the world, in fact, with using wastewater surveillance, a much better sense of how much virus is in the community. And so, just in following with your very thoughtful comment about case numbers dropping, that's exactly what we're seeing in most locations in this country, too. We, for example, here in the Minneapolis St. Paul area, have seen a dramatic decrease in wastewater activity in the last 2 months. So, I think we're in a place right now where I can hope it'll only get better. On the other hand, I have a lot of respect for this virus, and frankly, we all ought to have a lot of humility. We don't know if another variant will emerge that, with given how much immunity we have in our population, will somehow break through that and cause increase in surge in cases, or whether this will become kind of the norm and we'll see less and less. Now, you asked me about my case.
Yeah.
Uh, I have to say that I speak about this with really some trepidation in the sense
Mm.
that I was not going to get this. I
Right.
had been
You,
very faithful throughout the course of the pandemic, wearing my N95 respirator when I was out and about. I had been fit tested. In addition, when we finally did socialize in our home, we had what became affectionately known as the Osterholm rule. You could not have had no in contact with someone with COVID in the 5 previous days. You could have no symptoms yourself on the day of, and you had to test negative by a lateral flow test within 3 to 4 hours of coming. and we would entertain small 4 to 6 parties, and it was going wonderful. And then on March 10th, the night of March 10th, a colleague from work came over with Fern and myself. The three of us had dinner. We went down our elevator in our building here, which we're 31 stories up. No one else is in the elevator. And then we proceeded to go to a very small music venue where we wore our N95s. We were some distance from any other people, and we were there for an hour and 45 minutes. And literally 2 days later, almost 48 hours later, all three of us developed symptoms.
Mm,
None of us converted for another 24 hours. And then at that point, we all three tested lateral flow positive, and then went through the experience of the next 7 to 10 days. We all three took Paxlovid. I took it and was starting to feel better after that fifth day, and then I kind of crashed.
mm.
And at that point, I got a second 5 day course of Paxlovid. Started to feel better, and I was very happy to have this behind me. However, over the course of the last 10 days, I have really had significant fatigue. I'm not one that sleeps a lot, and so I more than enough sleep. But I can tell you there are multiple times in a day where I'm doing something like even doing what I'm doing right now, where I just feel like I just need to fall asleep. It's been really a challenge. The other thing that happened, which was in retrospect a little bit more concerning than I realized at the time, there was a period at about day 10 to 14 into my illness. I started losing my memory on many things of importance. I couldn't, for example, tell you what was that drink that is a champagne orange juice combination. I couldn't find the word mimosa if my life depended on it. If somebody asked me who was in Sleepless in Seattle, I had to think about now the movie. Who was in it? I couldn't remember. And I mean, in retrospect, I wasn't that concerned, thinking, it's not that bad. And it was actually quite remarkable. This lasted about 2.5, 3 weeks. And now I think, at least according to those around me, I have gained most of my memory back, but now I have this fatigue picture. So, as much as I don't know where I picked up the virus, all three of us picked it up. And as much as I feel like I have survivor's guilt right now, in the sense that I'm not that concerned about getting infected in a public exposure, given I probably have some pretty good protection at least for a few more weeks. But nonetheless, I think this potential fatigue issue is really a challenge.
Yeah, the things that you're bringing up with this, like for example, I know you had the initial series and three boosters, including the bivalent. Was that sometime in September last year? Or?
Yeah, it was 7.5 months before.
Yeah. So,
So that was, and I tried to get it at 6 months, the second. But in Minnesota, we actually have a registry, and so it's not just your white card that you could do it. And it wasn't I was trying to do something illegal, but this vaccine is just sitting there. So I tried to get another bivalent at 6 months post my first one, and of course I was turned down. And then 5 weeks after that, I got COVID.
yeah, and then of course, just recently, the FDA and CDC finally came to the conclusion that for people of our age group and immunocompromised, they certainly have the option that you've advocated for. And unfortunately, you weren't able to get at that time. Although I suspect the protection, you might comment on that, Mike, that there is some protection against infection for the first few months after a booster,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the studies that we've seen so far, at least, and particularly from those from other countries where they have remarkable follow-up on databases, there is some initial evidence of protection in those first weeks against getting infected and even potential transmission, but that wanes, unfortunately, quickly, and it's likely B cell related immunity. And then I think, as we also at least believe, the T cell immunity, which we're still all trying to understand and characterize, probably kicks in and gives us protection against serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. But as you and I have looked at, even then at 6 months out, you start to see some potential waning of that. And I think that's why we have a real challenge right now. I've said many times we can't boost our way out of this pandemic. And I meant that not because some of us wouldn't be willing to get a vaccine every 6 months, but the vast majority of the population would not. And we've even seen here with the first bivalent booster dose, which we know has provided good protection against serious illness, hospitalizations, and deaths. Look at the very small proportion of the population that have taken that, less than 40%. And so it's a challenge that how do we get people to keep getting vaccinated? A lot of people say, I'm done. I'm done with it.
Right, right. Unfortunately, especially those who are at high risk, it's really unfortunate. Now, one of the things you've done recently, among many things, you covered the status of the pandemic today and some liabilities for the future. And you've been working on the future with the blueprint that you put together for people, experts around the world, to try to map out managing a pandemic, preparing for the pandemic. Could you give us the skinny on that?
Well, actually, this was a report that is relabeled the COVID Wars, put out by the COVID Crisis Group, which was a loose affiliation of 34 individuals who had agreed to help out developing basic materials with the hope that that would lead to a post pandemic commission, much like the commission we saw after 9/11. And then the person that headed that up actually was the person who did head up the 9/11 commission also. And there was support from several foundations for this. When it became clear after almost a year of trying to pull together lessons learned, challenges to what we know and don't know, the U.S. government was not going to support another commission, either in the legislative side of the government or in the executive branch. Both of them basically said, well, we're not really interested. I think that's been a major mistake. But this report, which is now out, does address a number of the shortcomings that we have experienced with this pandemic. And again, in a world where it's so partisan and everyone wants to blame someone for something, this was not meant to blame. This was meant to be what we classically call a hot wash, where we go back over an experience to learn from it. What could we have done differently? How could we have done it? What did we do right? How do we have to make sure that that's in place in the future? And so this plan is about that very thing. Now, at the same time, I'm writing another book, much like the one I did, Deadliest Enemies, Our War Against Killer Germs, in 2017, when I laid out what a pandemic might look like. And this one is really to address what do we need to learn from this pandemic for the next one. And I go into a bit more in certain topic areas than our report did, much more in depth as it relates to vaccines, public health actions, lockdowns, all of those things. And so I hope that in a few months that will be available, so that not only does it lay out what the challenges were, but given my public health experience of 48 years and having been through these, what do I think the lessons learned should be, which some are not included in the COVID
Uh,
War Book.
I can't wait to read it. I mean, the roadmap, though, that you pulled together was really extraordinary. And of course, it addressed the things like coronavirus vaccine and so many others that we can pursue, hopefully, and be also templates for the future. Now, I want to go back now, since we were covering kind of the current and future status, but back in March 2020, you wrote that there would be, this is March 2020 now, there would be 800,000 deaths in the next 18 months from COVID. Talk about an oracle. I mean, obviously, no one would ever wanted that to see be actualized. But how did you know that, Mike? How did you know we were in store for such a dreaded outcome in an imminent period of time?
Well, take a step back to December of 2019. Our center has a very active news team that basically covers infectious disease news from around the world. Even though it's inside a CIDRAP, there's a thick wall between it and me from an editorial standpoint, so I don't have any control over it. But they notified me that they were picking up information that last week of December out of Wuhan about this emerging uh, outbreak of unexplained pneumonia. And, at that point, we stayed on top of it. And of course, my first thought was, could this be a flu situation with an emerging flu pandemic, or was it just more coronavirus? I right after 9/11, I spent 3 years as a special advisor to then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson. And I split my time between the University of Minnesota and the government. And it was during that time that I actually participated actively in the first SARS outbreak that occurred
Mm-hmm.
with regard to the U.S. involvement. And then in 2012, I had been serving as an advisor to the royal family of the United Arab Emirates. And when MERS first emerged on the Arabian Peninsula, I went over and worked on that issue. And then in 2015, when MERS exploded literally in Samsung Medical Center in Seoul, Korea, I was asked to come and I went over to Seoul and helped with that outbreak. So I had a pretty good feeling, I thought, for coronaviruses and of course, influenza is something that I had been working on for 40 years. And so initially I was saying, I hope this is a coronavirus because we know how to control that. It's not that infectious, even though the case fatality rates may be between 15 and 35%. Well, as you know, by the end of that first week in January, we had the data saying, yep, this was a coronavirus. But it was at that time that we had contacts in Wuhan and in Hong Kong, and we were basically getting information out and then, of course, following up with our colleagues in Singapore, the old flu network, that was suggesting that this was a very different kind of coronavirus. There appeared to be substantial transmission among those who were asymptomatic as well as those who were symptomatic. And as we saw more and more transmission outside of Wuhan, it reminded me a great deal of what we saw in 2009 with H1N1, where there, in the month after it was first discovered in Mexico, it was subsequently found in 128 different countries in just 1 month.
Mm-hmm.
And it looked like this is what this coronavirus was doing. And so on January 20th, actually, our center put out a statement saying, get with it, world. This is the next pandemic. It is a coronavirus acting differently than MERS and SARS. My worst fear was that the case fatality rate may be as high as that. Well, over the course of the next few weeks, we got more and better information about what was going on. And there was just such a denial at the time. In fact, I went to
Right.
JAMA and to the editors at JAMA and said, can I do a perspectives piece on why the world has to wake up quickly? This is going to cause a pandemic. They not only turned me down, but the following week they ran a cartoon in JAMA, a one pager, on one column looking at COVID and coronaviruses, on the right column looking at influenza. And they came to the conclusion, don't get distracted by this coronavirus thing. It's all about flu. And
Wow.
so I think at
Wow.
that time, there was such denial that was going on. And so when I first made this statement, I actually did it by the kind of the back of the seat estimate. You know, I'm not a black box guy. In fact, I find black boxes often, they sort of impress the hell out of you with their sophistication. And what they don't tell you is they have no clue what they're talking about. And so I just basically did a back of the envelope calculation and not even realizing vaccine might or might not come into play. So, I have to be honest and say it was in some ways luck, if and bad luck that it
Well,
was like
yeah,
that.
I don't know. I think it's a lot of wisdom
Uh,
admixed with that, but
but
it's
I want to
remarkable.
add one. I want to add one other thing, though, Eric, because the thing that I will most remember probably in this pandemic is not all the hate mail that I received from so many as the days went on, and even death threats. It was the feedback I got in that month of March
Mm.
from colleagues who thought that I was over the top, that I had finally, scared the hell out of people one too many times, kind of thing. And it was amazing to me, as much as we're critical of the politicians and what happened, and we surely should be, there were many of our colleagues who were equally in a state of denial, not wanting to believe that this was really
Oh,
happening like it was.
absolutely.
So I
Yes.
think that's what I'll remember is it's one thing to have some anonymous person tell you, that you should be dead. It's another thing to have one of your colleagues say you're irresponsible.
Yeah, you're not kidding there, and especially with you because everybody who's listening has seen you innumerable times on CNN, MSNBC, various news networks, and they know you come across with humility, unlike many other experts, where we just don't know, and also the master of metaphors, as far as I can tell about the eye of the hurricane and so many things like that. But the other thing I wanted to get into historically is something that brought us together that a lot of people still, it's been written about, but a lot of people still don't know. So back in the summer of 2020, you said, I'm going to organize a group that eventually became known as the Party Planning Group, that we meet every Friday morning for an hour or so, and we talk about, well, there's a pandemic and related matters. So you, again, had this idea to bring this group together. And could you talk about that? Because it's amazing. Here it is, 2.5 years later, we met today. We're
Yeah. Yeah.
continuing to meet. Tell everybody about whether that group, how you foresaw the need for it, and perhaps what do you think it's accomplished?
Well, first of all, let me start out with two caveats. Number one is, and thank you for your comments, but I realize the older I get, the more vulnerable I am to learning. And so I want to surround myself with people that can teach me, okay? The second thing is that humility should be considered a requirement today of trying to deal with pandemic viruses because we have to acknowledge we don't know what the next 210-mile-an-hour curveball is going to be. I can remember a light bulb moment for me early in January of 2021 when vaccines were now flowing. But in you and I together, we wrote a piece on this, saw alpha emerging out of Europe. And remember, up until that time, we kept being told that, well, these variants and subvariants are really just nothing more than rings on a tree. They're just telling you how old the virus is. And with alpha, we had clear and compelling evidence. Oh no, it had a lot to do with functionality, how infectious it was, etc., and that could very well change the complexion. And I remember very well being on Meet the Press in January of 2021 and saying I thought the darkest days of the pandemic were still ahead of us because of the number of people who were not vaccinated, the fact that this virus was going to continue to change. And of course, again, I caught a lot of heat for that. Nate Silver all but gutted me in public media for irresponsible. And of course, as you know, the vast majority of deaths occurred after that time in the
Right,
pandemic.
right.
But now to back up to your point and why I think some of the things that I was able to learn occurred was in the summer of 2020, a colleague of mine who very near and dear came to me and said that there is someone in the senior level of government that right now is making some major decisions, but really has no one around him he knows he can trust. Would you ever talk to him and provide what information you can to kind of give him a sense off the record? Well, I thought, actually, it would be better because there's a team of people I think that could be more helpful. I'm one voice, and I surely don't proclaim to have the only voice. So I actually literally went to my might say magical list. Who are the people that I most respected and admired, and who did I trust? And trust was huge. Trust was huge. And as you know, you're on that list, and it's now been publicly stated who Peggy Hamburg's on it, Peter Hotez, Bruce Gellin, Penny Heaton, and Bruce Gell and I'm missing someone. Anyway, Ruth Brookelman.
Yeah.
And we meet on every Friday, and our discussions are incredibly, incredibly thoughtful. They are honest, and there's a trust in that group. What we share stays there, and I so appreciate that. And so, from that perspective, that will continue, and I will continue to learn from all of you. And I think if it was any one lesson that I came out of from this pandemic, is just the value of having that kind of collective brain trust that can come in, ask questions. Many times we didn't have the answers, but we surely got the questions out, which then gave us opportunities to learn the answers. And the fact that we could do it, and you and I both knew that our comments were going to stay within the context of that group.
Yeah, and we had to keep it anonymous with this name of Party Planning Group just because we didn't want people to know what this was
Yeah,
really
at that
doing.
time it was interesting. I have to tell you, um, my administrative assistant was out one day during that early time period, and someone else was sitting in, and they saw in my schedule an hour blocked off for party planning, and it was right at the holiday season. So there was an assumption made in our center that I was just planning this big holiday party and that nobody knew about it yet. because it said party planning, and that rumor was spread throughout the entire center, and I had to self-correct, you might say, and explain we could still have a party, but that wasn't what this was about.
Yeah, well, it's been an amazing ride and it continues. But, we were there from well before there were vaccines all the way through, to the current time. And you can imagine all the different things that have been happening in the background and that we were discussing, exchanging ideas, communicating with public health agencies, the White House, and all sorts of other things along the way. So it's been a privilege for me, not just to have this conversation, but over these last 2.5 years to work with you on that. It's been extraordinary and to learn from you and our colleagues. Well, this has been so much fun for me, Mike. I just am struck by your ability to weave together, the wisdom you've drawn from all these experiences over 4 decades of working in this space with the ability to be humble and know that you're not the smartest guy in the room, no one's the smartest guy in the room, that you want to have other people, whether wherever they come from, like for example when you put together the roadmap and you brought together people from all over the world, to think, to exchange ideas about how we can do better, for this and future pandemics, because undoubtedly we're going to be facing those. So maybe, as we wrap up, could you just give us your sense? There's obviously climate change. There's all the things that have been done to the environment, and this pandemic, which we all wish to be, put aside, which the virus will be here for many years to come. But what are your expectations? Since unfortunately your predictions have come too close to real, or real, actual, precise, about the next pandemic.
Yeah.
Will it be influenza? Will it be in the next few years? What are your thoughts about where we're headed?
Well, Eric, let me just start out and say thank you for your very kind comments. I think one of the things I learned at CIDRAP a long time ago is the very name, the Center for Infectious Research and Policy. And I knew very early in my career that well designed, well conducted, even very important research means nothing if you can't translate that into active policy that makes a difference. At the same time, policy, if it's not informed by good research, can be dangerous. And so I think what you're highlighting here is how we try to bring groups of individuals together to merge research and policy together. And you just talked about the coronavirus vaccine roadmap, where 54 of the world's leading experts, including you, participated in that. And we developed a very, very specific outline for a roadmap of what needs to be done to get us to new and better coronavirus vaccines, and ones that basically will be hopefully broadly protective for any future coronavirus activity that occurs. So I can never say enough about the ability to bring shareholders together. Collective wisdom will win every time against a wisdom. And I think that that's one thing I learned. In terms of where we're going, I have to just think back into human history. And when you think about the fact that in 1900, average life expectancy in this country was about 43 years, and today, even with the pandemic, it's about 76, 77 years. For every 3 days we've lived in the last century and 20 plus years, we've gained 1 day of life expectancy.
Mm,
That takes us all the way back to the 80,000 generations to the caves. And I think what we haven't fully understood is that we lived in a world where infectious diseases had major impact on why we didn't live to be, as a median age life expectancy, up into the 70s, but rather into the 40s. And I think what we're facing today is a world that is moving us back to those numbers, not forward. For example, if you look at just the situation right now of world population, 8 billion people on the face of the earth. You look at what's happening with megacities around the world. I remember early in the days of HIV/AIDS making a trip to Kinshasa, Zaire, which
mm,
no longer Zaire, of course, where it was a large rural city. Today, it's 18 billion people.
mm,
When you look at the median age of Africa, it's 19 years. When you look at what we've done with human population and how we have reached out to every corner of the world seeking food, bushmeat, etc. Ebola has been a problem likely for many, many, many decades. But when it was in very rural, isolated villages of Africa, if 25 or 30 people got infected and died, no one even knew about it. Now, today, with the urbanization of Africa, you can see widespread transmission quickly in these areas. And this is true for all parts of the world. Think about avian influenza and the need today to feed 8 billion people. We have relied on birds, on the fastest, that as an animal species is the fastest conversion of energy to protein on Earth. And so look at the billions of birds we're raising, which now provide for a new reservoir for flu viruses. I could go down the list. Look at how climate change is moving in terms of precipitation levels and temperatures that now move mosquito populations to places of existence we didn't see before. And then added transportation in. Think about all of history till World War II. The four serotypes of dengue virus existed in four different
Mm,
regions of the world.
mm.
It wasn't until post World War II that now they all exist virtually where each one exists. Why do we have dengue hemorrhagic fever? It's because of that. And so I think that the final piece I would say is yes, pandemic's going to happen again. We are going to see more of what we've just experienced. And frankly, it could be a lot worse. We didn't see 15 to 35% mortality rates like you might with SARS or MERS. Instead, we saw just high transmission levels. There is nothing to stop the next coronavirus from being transmitted like SARS CoV 2 and killing like MERS or SARS.
Mm,
And
mm.
so I think we have to be mindful of that. And the final last thing I would just paint, this is our climate change issue in infectious diseases. It's antimicrobial resistance. It's amorphic. People all know it's there, what to do about it. And we are watching ourselves literally devolve back into a pre pandemic era of antibiotic resistance, meaning that, before our grandparents were around, people died often from common, cuts, bruises, etc., because they didn't have antibiotics. Look what's happened since that time. They've played a huge role. And
Sure.
now we're going to watch that, we're allowing that. And then last but not least, I just have to say this misinformation, disinformation on vaccines is huge. I think that we're going to continue to see increasing challenges with populations around the world no longer willing to take childhood immunizations or even other adult immunizations just because of the disinformation. So when you add that all up, it's job security, unfortunately, for a lot of us, and that's a sad commentary. It's a real sad
Yeah,
comment.
well, and as you pointed out so well just before we got started, with AI, it has the potential to amplify the mis and disinformation to unprecedented levels, and it's already so horrific as it is. So,
It's
uh,
bad enough that I can just say that there are times I read articles in newspapers and I'll get halfway through a quote and I'll say, "Who the hell said that?" According to Osterholm, and of course, what? But then,
right there you go.
what are we going to do when you and I end up on these bots? Where it's Eric Topol saying to the world, I was wrong. Vaccines aren't any good,
Yeah,
and people are going to see that, and it's not you.
right,
That
right.
concerns me a lot. That concerns me a lot.
No, it was deep fakes, and now it's going to another ultra level of that. It's pretty scary, actually. So, with all the things that we've been talking about, whether it's a potent virus or a tech like AI is becoming with generative AI, we've always got to look at both sides of this and be prudent, to put it
Yep.
mildly. Well, this has been
Thank
fun,
you.
and I
Thank
can't
you.
thank you enough. I would like to talk to you all day, but we've got a lot in there in a half hour, and I
Yeah.
know we'll get a lot of interactions from the folks that are listening. Mike, thanks, and looking forward to
Thank
extending
you.
all our communication and friendship
You're a
in the
gift
years
to all of
ahead.
us. You're a gift to all of us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's much too kind.